And now, without further ado, today's presenter is Jason Armbruster. He's our colleague here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Jason, I'm going to stop my share and you can take it away.
Sounds great. And Casey, thanks for the music up front. I grew up watching The Muppet Show, so that was quite entertaining. I appreciate that. So I'm going to share back and forth between a couple of windows today. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the side here to make sure you all are seeing what I expect you to. But if anybody thinks I'm showing the wrong thing at any time, just raise your hand and I will stop. I just want to make sure I'm always showing you the right information. So as Casey said, webinar today is going to be on building a data pipeline with AI using Claude Code. This is based on a project that I did for the NAIR team about a couple months ago. I definitely simplified this down so I could do it in an hour, but I wanted to show you all some of the process that I used. If you remember my last webinar, we were really looking at the chat-based AI tools and how you could use them for data profiling, doing a little bit of simple question asking, generating some simple charts. And if you remember, one of the things we talked about in the Q&A was that if you're working with multiple files, if you're working with large files, you quickly run into limits anytime you use a chat-based tool because they all have limits on how much data you can upload, mostly so we don't overuse them. But Claude Code can help us get around that. I'm not going to talk a lot about it today, but there are similar tools in this space like OpenAI's Codex that can do these things as well. So there are definitely other tools. If you don't have access to Claude for some reason, look at the other tools you have access to, and you may very well be able to do a lot of the same things that we're doing here today. The other thing we talked about last time was building a repeatable workflow. Like I can dump the AI data into the ChatGPT, let's say. I can have a conversation, and there's a certain amount of memory and things like that, but I really can't build something that I can run over and over and over again. For that, I really want a set of scripts. And again, Claude Code is really built around the idea of coding and building scripts so that then I can run this again and again. So that's another thing that'll be nice as we walk through this today. Again, I'm going to use this today to connect data sources from multiple different sources into a single view. So want to start off with what is Claude Code? So you're going to see me use Claude Code today inside VS Code. You can actually use it in a terminal completely independently. You don't have to use an IDE or anything like that. I've kind of gotten in the habit of using it in VS Code. So I'm going to show it to you that way. It can run either way. It's basically an agent that you can give instructions to. It reads and writes files on your computer directly. Now, the good thing about it is unless you run it with dangerous flags, and they literally call them dangerous flags, it asks you before it reads anything outside of the directory that you're working in. So you can have some confidence on that. And they are actually working on improving those features as well. It writes and executes code. So you can write pretty much any language. We're going to see today that it's going to use Python and JavaScript as we go through it, but I'm going to talk to it in plain English. I will say, I think we put in the headline here, I didn't want anybody to feel like they had the code to come to this. However, I will not pretend that not having coding experience is not useful in using a tool like this. I think we had a conversation yesterday where it was like, technically you don't have to have any experience to use a circular saw, but it sure helps in making sure you get a good result and you don't cut your fingers off. So I think it's similar in this case. So as you work through this, if you don't have a lot of coding experience, if I jump into something that you haven't seen before, definitely drop a question in the Q&A and we'll come back to it at the end. So what are we going to build today? So the idea here with this project was to build an interactive map on the right-hand side so we could see how people were interacting with the NAIR project from around the country. We really wanted to be able to show at a state level sort of what was happening. Were we hitting every single state? Were there only a few states? Kind of get that idea. So I had a ton of input files when I did this for real. I'm going to use two today. I'm going to look at applications to one of our workshops. Then I'm going to look at support tickets that we get through the NAIR project. I'm also going to bring in some reference data, and I'm going to do this in two stages. So you'll see I'm going to start with something that's just kind of a basic file that I built that maps email domain to institution information. And then we're going to come back and we're actually going to update that with IPEDS information, which I think is kind of the cool part here because we then are able to start to segment the data a little bit. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to build a SQLite database. If you're not familiar with SQLite, SQLite is a file-based database that runs on your system. It's super simple, but if you've ever worked with Oracle or any other SQL database, Postgres, any of those kind of things, MySQL, you can do a lot of the same things on SQLite without a server to run on. It's all just a file base that you can run locally. So for this type of project, I think it works really well. And it supports most of the SQL functions that you would want to have. This is the schema we're going to build. So one of the things I think is really important to do as you go into a project like this is have a mental model for what you think the AI tool is doing. And so I like to think about these tools in many cases as translators. A few years ago, we all got really used to Google Translate getting very good. And a lot of that underlying technology is what has resulted in the AI models we're using today. So I think we can think about these things as translators. And so I want to think about what am I translating from, but also what am I translating to? And so I'm going to spend some time up front, like thinking about like what should the model look like? And if any of you worked in like enterprise computing or interacted with that, this is a standard like CRM party model, if you've ever heard that term. Otherwise, if you haven't, don't worry about it. The key thing here is we have people. Those people have interactions. So they may have applied for the workshop. They may have submitted a ticket. We could have lots of different types. And then those people are part of organizations. And that's really what's going to allow us to map the organization to a state and start to do some more interesting things with this model. So again, this is the target I'm going to try to build here. And with that, the first file I'm going to load in, and then I'm going to go back over to Claude Code and just start doing that stuff. But the first file I'm going to load in is going to be the workshop applications. So just to give you an idea of what's in that file, these are a few rows. These are not real people. That doesn't mean the email addresses are not real, so please don't email these people because they might be. But these are people that I made up that are in this file. We have a few things here. One is we do have an email address here. So for any email address, we have an email domain. And that gives us some idea of the organization somebody works for. And you'll see on the second one is an AOL.com. I don't know who that person works for. I don't even know why they have an AOL.com email address in this day and age, but they do. So we're going to not be able to really map them. So there's going to be some places where we just have real gaps in the data that we can't do anything about. But we're going to start and we're going to try and make this work. So with that, let me switch my window here. It looks like everything's done okay. All right. And now we're going to go over to VS Code. So if you have not seen VS Code before, this is sort of my layout. You can have a million different layouts in here. You're going to see on the right-hand side is where I'm going to do most of my interaction with Claude Code. This is the chat window where I'm going to be able to build things here. I have a terminal window over here. I'm just going to show you up front, but just to make this a little easier ahead of time, I built a virtual environment for Python. I loaded a couple of packages because I know which packages I want them to use. Again, this back to the circular saw analogy. This is sort of, I know I want to use these things, so I'm going to give it that up front. But that's all I've given it. If I actually look at this directory, you can see there's nothing else in that directory except my virtual environment with those couple packages in there. So with that, when you use Claude Code, the first thing you want to do is initialize a project. So we have to tell it about what are we trying to accomplish so that it can build what are called steering files. You'll see Claude calls them claude.md, but all the various agents have different names for these files. Sometimes people just generalize to agents.md. But these are files that it will continue to reference as we go through the process to figure out how to approach whatever we're asking it to do. So I'm going to start. The first thing I always want to do is do a /init, which tells Claude Code, okay, I'm getting started. I'm going to paste this in because it's just easier for me to keep this going, but then I'll take a look at this. So here's what I'm telling it. I'm starting a new data analysis project. The goal is to create a data pipeline to ingest interaction data from their events and systems. I will use SQLite for the database. So I'm, again, telling it where I want it to go. And I will be looking to build a standardized data model that can be used as a basis for visualizations. This last piece I just started using, I would say a month or so ago, based on some things I was reading, and I found it very interesting. So if you're looking for tips on Claude Code, try this idea of using red-green TDD. That's a very programmer kind of centric thing. What that means is we're going to use test-driven development. Test-driven development means I want to write my tests before I ever write the code. And basically all of the models know what you mean. If you just say use red-green TDD, it's 5 tokens, but you're only using 5 tokens to get a lot of power from this. So I'm going to start with that, and we'll see as we go through that Claude will actually build tests. The tests will fail, then it will write the script, then it will run the test, and the test should pass. And if they don't, then it will continue to iterate. So let's start here, and then we'll take a look at what does it actually build. So you'll notice right away, it starts asking me, is it okay to do this? Can I look at what's in the directory? So I've got this set up pretty tight so you all can see that the permissions here, it's going to ask me a lot of individual things. As I go through, I might start to say, yeah, don't ask me about that anymore. Like this one, I probably wouldn't care. It's not giving me the option, but I want it to be able to read the directory we're in. But you'll see, this is one of the nice things about the way Claude Code's built is it doesn't just get to do anything on my system. It just basically asks me anytime it's going to do something that is new or that I haven't told it ahead of time. Okay, so here's a great example. So now it's going to write out this Claude MD file. So it's looking already and saying, okay, we know what Claude MD does. It provides guidance. We're going to do this data pipeline for ingesting narrative event and system interaction data. So that it came all out of my prompt. It noticed that I have a Python virtual environment. It knows how to activate it. It says, oh, we're going to use SQLite. We're going to use Rapid Fuzz. And notice that I had that. It wrote my development standards out here. And it also decided, hey, we're going to look at this like how to run the tests. And actually, this is one thing I did not point out, but you can have a global configuration for Claude on your system as well. And this one, I dropped in my global one. You can also steal this one if you want, only because I get so tired of telling Claude, no, it's not Tuesday, it's Wednesday. So now I just tell it, check the system every time. I'm going to allow it to edit this file just going forward so we don't have to look at it every time. But that's what the init process is going to create, is just that claude.md. And again, it's going to read that every time I ask it to do something from now on, and it'll give it context for what it's going to do. The other thing it will do as it goes along is it will update that documentation. So as I ask it to do more things, we can come back later and look at that file and see what it's done. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do, again, thinking about these as a translator, I want to give it the destination. What am I going to try to accomplish with this? So I'm going to paste in my next prompt here, and then I'll talk it through. So I'm going to create a SQLite database. We talked about that with 3 tables. And I showed you the diagram there, organizations, people, interactions. I tell it a little bit about what might be in those tables. I don't actually have to give it every single thing that might store in there. It will figure it out as we go forward. But I tried for the sake of this webinar to not iterate too much on that. So I gave it most of the field names. I wouldn't necessarily have to do that. I also did this thing to say use appropriate primary keys and foreign keys. And if you're not a relational database person, all that means is one table points to the other table, and the data has to exist in one table for it to exist in the other table. So if we think about, I can't have a person, or I can't have an interaction without a person. That's the kind of thing we want to do in database language. So I'm going to do that. We're going to give it a minute here. Okay, so you notice right away it said, okay, let me set up the environment, then follow TDD. So it's following my instructions. It's going to ask me, can I activate the virtual environment? I'm going to let it do that. And I did, if you notice, click the one that says, don't ask me about that again. And again, this is, okay, I'm going to run the Python test. I don't want it to ask me this every time. I'll show you while it's doing that. What it's actually building out is this settings.local.json, and you'll see, make this a little bit bigger. You'll see those things that I'm approving for it to always do start getting dropped in this allow list. So that's the file it actually builds out to say, oh, I don't have to ask you again if this command matches this. And you can edit that file manually. I'm also going to allow it to do pip install because it's making a good point. I didn't install PyTest ahead of time, and I told it to use tests, so it's going to need that. All right, so you'll see now it's doing the red phase. So it's writing failing tests first. We're going to kind of watch over here and see what it builds. So here's a tests. Here's an init.py that probably has nothing in it. That's pretty standard for Python. Now it's thinking about what else it's going to do. Okay, now it wrote a test database script. And if we look at this, we can see, okay, so it's going to create an in-memory database for testing. This is something that SQLite supports, and usually test suites will run against memory databases. It's just faster. You can see that it created a bunch of helper functions, table names, columns, foreign keys. And then it comes down here and starts to say, like, does the test have the right primary keys? Is the name correct? It does a bunch of things that basically are coming out of what I told it to do. Are all the right fields there? Those kind of things. It tries to do some inserts and things like that. I'm not going to bore you with the details of this, but you can see it wrote a relatively thorough test suite right away here. Now it's going to say, okay, I want to run that test suite. We expect it to fail. All tests failed. Database module doesn't exist yet, okay? And if we were to look at this, you'll see in here, it just basically says there's no module database, so there's no way to even run the tests. Okay, now it did that and it ran the tests. That went pretty fast. So all 24 tests passed. Well, now if we look at what it created, in addition to the tests, we actually have this database Python script now. And this actually, if you're SQL literate, this shows you actually what it's creating in terms of the data definition language. So you can see that it went ahead and created exactly what I kind of asked it to do. It creates these tables, it creates the foreign keys and primary keys, things like that. So I'm pretty happy with that now. I have that here. I have these 24 tests. It ran the tests, they all passed. If I wanted to, I could look in to see, okay, which test actually ran. You can see all the tests there. So I can kind of watch this as it goes along. And as you're getting familiar with this, I would recommend, like, if something gets crunched in the chat, expand it, look at it, understand what Claude's doing, because the only way you're going to know whether it did what you want it to is to observe it. Now, over time, I think you get familiar with it and you start to realize, oh, it does the same thing here every time. I don't have to watch that. But I really did start with, like, I want to see every single step it takes. One of the jokes, I think, in the coding assistant world is that you start in this mode where maybe you have half and half of your screen, like I'm showing you here, and that over time you sort of do this. And I think it's a good visual metaphor for, like, over time, I just trust the agent more because I start to realize it's pretty good at certain things. So for this webinar, I'm going to kind of show you everything that it does, but know that when I use this day to day, that's not really the way I use it. Although there's a lot of things I'm willing to trust it to do because it's pretty good at it. Okay, real quick, I'm going to drop in some files here before I take the next step, and then I'll show you what these files are. The reason I didn't put these in here ahead of time is because Claude's actually smart enough. It'll go out and look at all the files in your directory and say, oh, you wanted me to do this, and it'll just run. And it would almost go end to end without me doing any more, and that would be a pretty boring webinar. So I didn't want to do that, so I tried to do this. So I'm going to show you, here's our workshop applications. This looks a lot like what we talked about. You'll see the first row is actually column names, which is super helpful because otherwise Claude wouldn't know what the data is. The other thing I did here, just for fun, is I created this edu domains, and this is actually a JSON dictionary inside Python, just for the sake of saying, like, not all of your data has to be CSVs. It can be all kinds of different formats. These tools are really good at understanding common data formats. So those are the two things I have. So I have the one file that is workshop applications. I have the other one that says, here's a bunch of domains that I knew what the organization information was for those. Okay, so now I'm going to ask it to load that data into the tables that we created. Again, I'll paste this in. Okay, I'm just saying now, load workshop applications.csv into the database. For each person, extract their email domain, look up the domain, and I'm going to take this out actually because I did not put it in a subdirectory. In edu domains, define the institution name, state, and city. Create or find the organization record, create the person record, deduplicate by email, create an interaction record of type workshop application. This is step by step what I want it to do. This is something I find really helpful is if you really know every step you want it to take, give it the list. These tools will follow the list really well. And then some exceptions down here at the bottom. If a domain isn't found in edu domain, still create the org, but leave the state fields empty. Track how many were mapped versus unmapped. So as we see the end of this, we'll be able to actually get a sense of how useful was that edu domains file that I created. And as you can imagine, for something like this, I intentionally left some things out because it's going to be more interesting if we have some gaps. So you can see it first looks at what's actually in the files. It reads the files and tries to find these things. Now it's going to write the failing tests. So again, we're using that red-green TDD approach. So first we write the tests, then we write the code that actually should make the tests pass. If we keep an eye over here, we should start seeing some more tests pop up as it does this. Okay, there it goes. So now it wrote a test for this load workshop. And we could walk through here, but you could see it kind of created some sample data that's going to use for the test. So it's not relying on my real files, and it's going to go through and actually try to load these to a database. That's all fine. I'm going to allow it to run the test. They're going to fail. That's what we want. The reason I think this is such a sort of unlock for some of the power here is because you're actually asking the tool to sort of understand what you're trying to accomplish twice. And it really is the same way this works with a human, is if you have to understand the problem twice, you have to understand it once to write tests, and then you have to understand it again to make those tests pass. You sort of get two passes at making something higher quality. And so I think it works very similarly with these tools that way. And again, it's 5 tokens, so it really doesn't hurt us at all to do this. Okay, so now it actually wants to run this script to say, go ahead and connect to the database, open this file, and load the applications. So we're going to let it do that. Okay, now we can see what happened. So it created 55 organizations. It got 200 people and 200 interactions. We had 200 rows in the table, so I think that's good. We got 76 of these domains that mapped and 124 that didn't. And we can see in here that there's a bunch, these EDU domains, we should be able to figure out what institution those are. In fact, Colorado's in there. We should definitely be able to figure that out. But there are some that aren't going to get there. The AOLs, like we talked about earlier, things like that. Okay, so that's what actually loaded. It's going to rerun the tests again here. I don't know that I need it to here, but it's being very thorough. Oh, and it actually spit out in the chat here, so you can see this. Okay, so unmapped count is high, and this is interesting when you have these interactions because it says, oh, wait, I can tell it's missing major research universities. There's all these different reasons that it gives you. And this is helpful as you're going through and doing this in the first place, because you might say, you know, you're right about that. I probably have this other source of data, or I could just tell you where these institutions are, things like that, that you could work to improve this as you're sort of doing this interactively. I'm not going to take that approach today because I want to leave this gap and show you how we fill it in later. But so that's what we did for workshop applications. So now I want to do the same thing with the support tickets. Okay, so sorry, I'm copying these off screen, but you'll see this support ticket file now. This is a totally different data format. It's still a CSV, but the columns are different. We do have email address, which is the only reason this whole thing is going to work, right? But as we'll find, actually, this is an interesting data set because sometimes, this is coming out of a JIRA system, sometimes those tickets actually don't have the real person that we're helping as the requester. The requester is whoever put the ticket in. And so because of that, and because I know that for this application, I'm going to put that in my prompt. But I will tell you, when I did this the first time, what I did as a quality check is I started going in and asking questions about, like, how many times do I show up in the database? And pretty quickly I saw, like, that's way too high. I shouldn't have that many interactions in there. So I started just asking the tool questions about, why is that? What do you see? What are the patterns that you see that's creating this problem? And it pretty quickly uncovered exactly what I'm going to put in the prompt here. So you see, I want to load support ticket CSV. This file has a different format. I tell it a little bit about the format. The reporter field sometimes contains a team member name instead of the requester email. When reporter is not an email address, use creator email instead. I did that for simplification here. I'll tell you, in the real data, I actually had to go so far as to read the description from JIRA and figure out who was the first email address in the description in some cases in order to figure out who the ticket was really for. Each row is one support ticket interaction. I did tell it the date format here. This is a different date format than what was in the other file. It's going to figure out how to handle that. I don't have to really worry about it. I also want to make it clear that some of these people may already exist in the database. So I want it to deduplicate by email. There's another thing that before it used to take a while to write these scripts. You could tell it, hey, this is what I want you to deduplicate on, and it'll write the script to do that. And that's a really helpful thing. When I did this for real, I think I loaded probably 28 different files. And so that deduplication was huge. And I told it, load it as interaction type support ticket. All right, so it's going to read the file. It's going to look at this. We have 301 rows, 300 data rows. Okay. Now, if we look at this, it's actually going to do a little bit of analysis at that particular thing that I told it, like if we have reporter and creator and they're different. So this is just a script that it's writing off the cuff to sort of check that pattern that I told it about. It's not saving that file anywhere. We don't really need that. It's just doing that to sort of make sure it understands the file format. Okay, so now we're into the red phase. So it's going to write the tests again. We should see some more tests pop up here. Widen this a little bit again so that. Okay, so we can see now it's doing the same thing it did before. It's writing a test. that actually does some sample data and goes through and tries to load that. Again, when it runs the test, it's loading it to a memory database that it throws away. So these are pretty harmless. And I find that anytime I have a test or a code base, I want tests associated with it because otherwise I never know if it's working in the future. And honestly, after 6 months of not looking at code, I read the tests first because it's easier to understand what was this supposed to do again? What did I think I was accomplishing? So I always love to have those test suites. Okay, you can see it wrote the load support. So it's actually writing the module that's going to load these things now. We could look at that as well. And again, you can see it's going to convert the date format. So it noticed that these date formats didn't match. We need to make those match. We're going to pull in the email and handle the reporter or creator. And then it's going to go through and actually load into the tables that we have. So now it's asking me, are you okay if I go ahead and load things? So yeah, let's do that. Okay, so if we look now at what did it accomplish? Oh, we just added 3 new organizations. So there are 3 organizations in that second file that didn't exist in the first file. We also have 105 new people. So now we have a total of 500 interactions across the 2 files. We have 106 that are mapped and 194 that aren't mapped. And then we see people appearing in both data sets as 72. So we get some interesting information about what's happening. And actually, this table does an even better summary. It didn't do this last time. That's really nice. One of the things that's interesting about running these demos is it changes a little bit every time. So anyway, so it gives me a pretty good summary of what's going on there. So now we're at a point where we have kind of loaded the data that we wanted to handle. We've got the basic interaction model that we talked about. I want to do some validation. So I like to do a few things. So I'm going to start. I could get into SQLite and write SQL queries, but why would I? I can let the tool do it. So I'm going to say, show me 5 sample rows from each table so I can spot check that the data loaded correctly. It should, in a moment, write a SQL query that it's going to run. You can see it's doing a select from each, limit 5, exactly what I would have written. It's handling the joins and all that kind of stuff, though, so I really just don't have to think much about this. And then I can look at, okay, here's our organizations. We see the email domain, we see the name of the organization. Where we had a match, we get a real name. Everywhere else, we're just using the domain for now. So of these 5 sample rows, which were just a random sample, only one of them probably matched my edu domains. We can see the people who were actually loaded. We can see that in this case, it happened to select all interactions that are workshop applications, but the data is all there. So that's the first check is like just sanity. Did it do the right thing? And again, it tends to ask pretty good questions here. Anything look off or ready to continue? So I'm ready to continue. I'm going to go ahead and do one more here and say, let's get another summary. And actually, this might just be duplicating what I had before here, but I'm saying, show me a summary within the database, total organizations, people, interactions. Then show me top 10 states by number of interactions. So one of the things that's interesting here, this is mostly going to duplicate what it just spit out automatically, but by asking it for the top 10 states, I start to evaluate this data set to say, does it actually answer the question I started out wanting to ask? So we'll see, okay, we are actually getting some sense of what are the top 10 states by interactions? How many people are associated with it? Now, right now, though, we have 318 of 500 interactions that have no state map. This isn't a very good representative sample of what we actually want to know here, but at least it's heading in the right direction. So let's pretend like we're okay with that data quality. I'm not, but let's pretend like that for now. The next thing I want to do is actually create a visualization of that data. And then we'll come back and improve it here in a few minutes. So the next prompt I'm going to do, nope, that's not what I wanted. What? Oh, I think I just pasted over my own document. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to tell it I want an interactive HTML visualization showing a US state map where each state displays the number of unique people and total interactions. I want it to use a clean professional style. States with no data should be light gray and include a legend explaining the color coding. So what's going to happen here is it's going to go through the same process. It's going to write some tests. It's going to write some code. First, it's going to go through and actually look at the data to make sure it understands what it's trying to accomplish. It actually, interestingly enough, does a very similar query to what I did here. To sort of understand, can I answer the question that you're asking before I try to build a visualization? This part, honestly, is the most magic to me. Not that any of this is really magic because it's just code behind the scenes, but I am not a front end person. When I think about like building data visualizations, things like that, that's not my forte. I could do the back end stuff all day long, but I really am not very good at the front end stuff. So the ability to generate something like this and then iterate on it to get it to look like what I really want it to look like and tell it like visually, I think this is wrong, or I can describe things that are wrong. That's really powerful. I'm not going to do all that today just for the sake of time, but I do want to kind of give you the idea that like once you get the first visualization, you can paste in screenshots, you can describe things that you don't like, you can tell it to change colors, all the things that you might want to do if you are working with somebody who's building a visualization for you. You can have that same conversation with the tool, and it will continue to iterate. Is it as good as a real human visualization designer? Definitely not. But for somebody like me that's relatively ignorant in that space, what's going on here? It was good enough for this tool, for this pass. Okay. Apparently, I'm having some connectivity issues. Let's just try that again. Here's the live demo bug. We'll see if this works any further. I didn't show you this actually. If it when it puts these thought things, you can actually expand those too, and it will sort of say, "Well, here's how I'm interpreting what you want me to do." While that's going, okay. I'll give it another 30 seconds here, and if it doesn't, I do have the cake I can pull out of the oven to show you what it did before. But I'm hoping to just show you the real thing. Okay. Well, I'm not going to waste more time here. It may come back around, but it seems like I'm having some Claude issues or Claude's having some issues, one of the two. That's a good point for it to happen, actually, because I can actually go over to my pre-baked cake and show you what we have. And the thing I'm not going to be able to show you since Claude's not working is how we got the iPads data in. But for anybody who's not familiar, iPads data is a classification system for different higher ed institutions. So it puts the institutions not just into uh, sort of gives it. I'm sorry, let me step back. iPads data can give us two things. One is it can fill in the gaps in the institutions that I hadn't identified, because one of the things it has is it knows the website domain for every institution in the US. And so it can map that to the email domain. And as long as they match, it works. The other thing it can do is categorize. And so let me switch over and show you. There we go. So after the next two steps, here's where we would have ended up. What I hope to show you is that the first time through, you'll see a ton of gray states because we were not able to identify any more than 138 of those interactions. And once I added in the iPads data, we get a whole lot better. But you can see that with just a simple prompt, it created a pretty useful visualization here where every state is color coded. I can see as I hover over the states how many people, how many interactions we had. And the thing that I thought was most powerful here is when I added the iPads data, suddenly I was able to sort by institution sector. When I did this for real, I also added the Carnegie information, which is a research classification, and it was also able to start to break things down. So I could start to show different visualizations based on different categories of institution. And you can see this as interactions, it's people here. So it gave me something that's interactive in HTML that I could do with this. Now, when we actually wanted to present this for real, we were going to put it into PowerPoint slides. So we didn't want all this interactivity. So I did a bunch of iteration with the tool to actually make this a static thing that we could put in a PowerPoint tool. But I just wanted to show you that the HTML that just came out with a simple prompt is pretty darn good for a first pass here. And so since Claude is not being friendly to me, I think I'll stop there and maybe we can switch to Q&A.
All right, Jason, I'm going to be asking you the Q&A today. So,
Fantastic.
okay. So the first question we have is, can you comment on using Claude Opus versus Claude Sonnet or other models?
Yeah, so for people who aren't familiar, most of the foundation model providers have multiple different models that you can work with, and they come with different price points. With Claude, Opus is sort of their most expensive, most capable model. Sonnet is sort of in the middle, and then they usually have one called Haiku that's sort of the cheap model that can do basic things. I will say, in my experience, for something like what I did today, where I'm kind of walking through step by step, I could do it all with Sonnet, and that would not be a problem. I did it with Opus in this demo, which is probably why we saw some of the more interesting things that it came back with in terms of feedback for me. But either could work for this purpose. If I wanted to just drop all the files in the directory and just tell it what I wanted to do and let it spin, I would definitely use Opus, because Opus is a lot more capable for those long running tasks. So if you think you can describe your task well enough that you could just drop in your data and walk away and come back a half hour later, that takes a much better description to be successful, but Opus is the way to go for that. But honestly, for day-to-day stuff, I use Sonnet almost exclusively just because it burns my tokens slower.
That runs into the next question perfectly, Jason. So, how expensive is this, and how quickly do you run out of tokens budget?
So for me, and I'm personally subscribed to this, so this is my personal Claude subscription, so I'll talk about it from that perspective. The up until Opus 4.6 came out, I was using the $20 a month pro subscription to Claude, and that was enough for me to get by to do everything I needed to do for this. Two things were problematic there. One is that you get a limit, so that every 5 hours, I think they say you can do 10 to 40, depending on the complexity, chat interactions under that pro plan. I would hit that, and I would have to wait to the end of the 5 hour window and then go to do the next thing. So it's definitely kind of a thing that stuck. When Opus 4.6 came out, at least initially, it was much more expensive. They've actually brought down the price since then. So I did personally upgrade to a max subscription, which is 5 times the number. And since then, I have not actually hit my limit, except on one situation where I really tried to give it a hard problem. So that's kind of to give you an idea of what the cost is. It's relatively inexpensive at $20 a month. You can also, I think, pay annually if you want to do it that way.
Thanks, Jason. And someone else asked, in terms of token limits, is there anything you should be aware of so that you're not wasting tokens unnecessarily?
I would say yes. We sort of talked about this on the last webinar too, but I always try to think about, when I'm asking a question of an AI tool, what is the context it actually needs to answer the question? So with projects you work on for a long time, one thing that can happen is Claude.md, that steering file, gets really, really big. And at some point you start to go, well, it's reading that on every single request, and it's eating a lot of tokens that way. So it's nice to actually go in and manually edit that and make sure that only has the most important things in it. And there are techniques you can use, like telling it in Claude MD that, hey, this other file should be read only in these situations, that sort of can optimize your token usage. Because I'm using the seat-based license, it's less of an issue for me, because before I run out of tokens, I will hit my limit. And so the cost never goes up for me. If you're using a token-based license, it changes because you could technically spend as many tokens as you want. But those are some techniques you can use. There's lots of different techniques that are coming along, and I think we're all kind of figuring this out as we go along. So there's opportunity to get better and better at managing tokens. But I think the big thing I always ask myself up front is, like, what does the model actually need to know to solve this particular problem? And how do I try to make sure it has as little extraneous thing as I can? One other thing I'll just show you. I didn't do it today because I thought it would be a little confusing in the webinar. But usually when I go through this kind of thing, every single time I put in a new prompt, I will hit a new chat. And the reason for that is because now I have clear context. The only thing it's going to read is Claude.md. Now, the exception to that is if it builds something and I don't like it and I wanted to fix it, then I'd stay in the same chat. But as soon as I'm like done with a feature, I switch to a new chat, because that's another place where you can save tokens.
Thanks, Jason. Can you load the data into data warehouses in cloud platforms such as AWS?
You definitely could. I chose to do this with SQLite because it didn't require a lot of the authentication and setup that would have to happen with a database like that. But these tools definitely understand how to write code that can write to databases, that can write to S3, things like that. The key thing is you have to think about how you give the tool access to credentials to do those things. And I didn't want to complicate this particular project with that. The reason that that's somewhat challenging is because if you just drop that in the directory, then the model has access to your secrets to actually do things. And you might not always want that because the model can put that secret kind of anywhere it has access to. So when you actually have like authentication secrets and things like that, the best practice is usually to keep it outside the directory and create some way where the tool can read it only when it needs it. Or maybe even better, only use it when it needs it, never read it. So there's techniques for that. I'm not going to get into the details there, but those are definitely things to think about if you're going to go after something that requires authentication.
Okay. Have you used the planning mode for larger complex projects, and can you describe that process?
Yeah, sure. So let me share my screen again. I'll show you real quick. Um, down here, I can go into something called plan mode. I do use this quite frequently. I would say I use it almost more for asking questions about a current code base than I do about planning a feature. But you could do it both ways. What plan mode does is says basically don't edit any of my files. Let's just have a conversation about what you can see in the directory. So it can read everything, but it can't write to anything. And that's a really nice thing, especially if you're looking at a code base that you don't own, where you can start to kind of have a conversation with the model to say, like, help me understand what's actually happening in this code base. Plan mode's great for that. When I'm trying to think through like a prompt I want to give the model that might go for 10 or 15 minutes independently, honestly, I will usually go to a different chat window entirely. I might even use a different chat tool and have some conversation back and forth to sort of develop some sort of spec or some document that describes what I want to do, and then I'll paste it into Claude. Do I have to do it that way? No, I could probably use plan mode. That's just sort of the way I started working with things.
Okay, this one might not be different than what we already talked about, but I'll ask anyways. Can this flow be used to connect to different existing providers like AWS, Azure, et cetera? Anything else we need to add there?
No, I think that's basically the same. Like I said, the big thing there is authentication. It's not a lack of understanding. The one thing I would say, I guess I do have one thing to add to think about that is you can point the model at documentation. So if you're using something that's like not super common, it can be helpful to actually say, here's where I want you to go read the documentation about how to do this thing. And you can give it specific URLs for like an AWS or an Azure service or something like that. And I've seen good use of that.
Okay. Do you use skill.md file always? And can you explain what skill file is a little bit?
Sure. So the answer to the first one is a little easier. No, I don't. I mean, for a small project like this, I don't use skills. What is a skill? So a skill is basically markdown, so a text document, kind of like the claude.md file, that describes how to accomplish a particular thing. So in this case, I could have said, here's a bunch of things I want you to think about that I got from a visual designer ahead of time. When you do your visual design for the visualization, please use this skill. And I can give it sort of a list of skills. Trade-offs around that get back to that question about token usage, is that if I use too many skills, the model can decide to load them all, and now I've got a bunch of context that's probably not relevant to the particular task I'm asking for. I do find skills super useful, and you can find some pretty good repos out on the internet of skills other people have written for quality checking, I guess, is probably the most common situation. So I will go and have a look and say, okay, I read a bunch of Python scripts. I want a skill that is an expert Python developer that can review that code and give me suggestions for things to fix. So that's a place where I definitely would use a skill. I did build a skill, and I am not ready to release it yet, but that starts to do the email domain to institution mapping that we did here. So I think that might be something that's reusable. So at some point in the future, maybe that's something I could share.
Great. Can you compare the capabilities of Claude versus Codex?
I'm probably not the best person to answer this. I've used Claude Code for probably a few hundred hours. I've used Codex for 10, maybe. So I don't really have a sense. I do think that they are comparable in a lot of ways. Probably the biggest difference in the short time I've used it that I've noticed is not all that different from using Claude on the web versus using ChatGPT. I don't want to personify, but there are sort of different, I don't know what term to use other than personalities for these chat models, right? You get different things. A lot of times people say Claude sounds like a professor, right? And I think it can. So you definitely notice that in the coding interactions too. But as far as the capability of the tool, I think they're pretty similar. Most of what I have done in some cases when I have a larger code base is I will take it out of Claude Code and I'm working on building it. I'll take it over to Codex and say, do a code review. and just try to get a different perspective with a different model to see like, what did I do wrong? And I find that Codex is actually pretty solid at doing code review. So again, I'm not an expert in that for sure, but that's some observations.
Thanks, Jason. If we were to use external data sources or APIs, is it easy to integrate? And also, how do we ensure that's not accidentally overwriting stuff?
It's a really good question and one you want to think a lot about. I would say spend some time in plan mode or another tool reviewing the API documentation so that you make sure that you are asking the model to only use the features that you want. Um, this is a constant challenge though, is making sure that the model doesn't do something you don't expect. You can instruct it to say don't overwrite anything, but that instruction is not a guarantee. It's just a guideline, right? So I like to say like only use these 5 API functions that I know are not going to destroy anything. The other thing is just standard development practice, like have a test environment, have a development environment, work there, make sure you know the code works before you put it in production.
Jason, are there any known concerns regarding how this handles proprietary data and information?
Yes, absolutely. So it's really important when you go into these interactions with any of these tools that you understand under what terms are you using the tool. Because depending on the tool, depending on how you're using it, there are different protections around your data. And so anytime you're thinking about anything that's not public data, you definitely do not want to use the free versions of these tools. You want to use an institutional purchase. You want to go to a higher tier. You want to do something like that and make sure you understand what the data protections are before you ever let the tool access data that has any privacy implications or anything else that you wouldn't want on the internet, basically.
Is there any particular kind of task or process at which Claude is really good or bad? And for something the latter, bad, would you recommend some other tool?
Um, so Claude is still pretty good at this, but in terms of other tools, if I'm starting like a brand new application that I might want to deploy on the web, I tend to start with a tool called Replit. Replit actually uses Claude on the back end, but it's a little bit more structured for the early phases of like, I want to prototype this thing. I want to play around with different UI designs. I want to get something that's up and running pretty fast that I can play with. Um, Once I get beyond the initial phase with Replit, I have a tendency to still make changes in Replit, but always ask Claude to review it. So I kind of have them work in tandem. On the other side is what is Claude bad at? Um, if you're not somebody who lives in this world of development of a particular type of application all the time, sometimes I would say Claude, I don't know, it's worse than any other model, but any of them can kind of go off in weird directions in terms of it might decide to use libraries that you've never heard of and that nobody else uses. Things like that. It's not super common, but I have seen it happen if you're not really specific. So that also tends to be why I will start a project and I'll say, I want you to use these 3 libraries. Because then I kind of take that out of the way. But I don't know if that's unique to Claude, but I've definitely seen it with Claude.
Okay. Would ChatGPT be good for planning and then Claude Code for execution?
Yeah, I think that can be a great way to go about it. I don't want to make any sort of magic out of that. You're still talking to an AI model. They still have a lot of the same biases and things like that. So using two tools, I don't think actually contributes to a higher quality necessarily, but it does sort of give 2 different approaches to something, and that can sometimes result in better outcomes. So it can be helpful. I do that a lot. I use Gemini probably more often when I'm sort of thinking about how to develop a particular tool. But yeah, it can be useful.
Thanks. We have one last question here. Um, what is the minimum level of coding knowledge needed?
It depends. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So if you wanted to ask Claude to organize a directory of files, you probably don't have to have any coding knowledge. It might write a script on the back end, it might not. But for that kind of thing, you can pretty much ask it to manipulate files, do those kind of things without much coding knowledge. If you're doing data manipulation, I think you do need coding knowledge. Back to the circular saw example, like you could do it without that knowledge, but you might hurt yourself in the process or hurt somebody else. So I wouldn't trust the data without the ability to kind of understand what it's doing. And that's why I really like I talked about at the beginning, to think about what am I translating to? Because if I can get really clear on what do I want the output data model to be, then I think I get better results and I'm more confident in the results.
Thanks, Jason. That's our last question.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. Casey, I don't know if you had anything else you want to say or she had to step away, but I really appreciate the time. If there's other things you want to hear from us, feel free to reach out with ideas. We're definitely looking for anything people would like to learn more about.
Thanks everyone for attending. We've got the Nair Pilot YouTube channel and the post-webinar surveys available here with the QR codes. And Becky will also add the links to the chat. We'll be following up with you when we have more information about the upcoming events. Thanks again for attending.